Murray Humphreys struck me as a very honorable, decent individual.
Yeah, Murray Humphreys was responsible for many deaths, but never convicted of murder.
Well, I don't think that there was anybody that could intimidate Murray Humphreys.
He was taught excellent manners, never swore in front of a woman.
I knew that he was a murderer and an extortionist and an intimidator and an acid thrower and everything. I knew all the bad things about Murray Humphreys. I learned to have a grudging respect for that man, and I knew that I was never going to see him again. I was never going to have a contact with him again, and it saddened me. It really did.
The tomb in Oklahoma of a great American gangster. Of all that generation born at the turn of the century who created the modern underworld, he was the most brilliant, most amusing, and ruthlessly determined. He was christened Llewellyn Morris Humphreys, born in Chicago of Welsh-speaking parents. But he called himself Murray Humphreys, and so became known as Murray the Hump Humphreys, and so Murray the Camel. When his great friend and colleague Al Capone went to jail in the 30s, he succeeded him as public enemy #1, the only Welshman in the Chicago gangs. His political insight for that world was incomparable. As Churchill said of great Welsh political genius David Lloyd George in an elegy, he always knew what was happening on the other side of the hill. Murray Humphreys always tried to stay out of the light. His full name isn't even on his tomb. He died in 1965 at the age of 66, still working, still shaping the America we know. How did this son of poor Welsh immigrants in Chicago, this infant prodigy of crime, come to be one of the most powerful men the United States has ever known? In that house, here in the near north side of Chicago, Murray Humphreys was born in 1899. His parents, like millions of other immigrants, had come here to escape poverty in Europe. They found it here too. This was the Italian section of the city. In Chicago then, a classic battle was going on between syndicalist socialists and raw capitalism. That was on one level. On another level, there was a battle for possession of the streets. Murray Humphreys left school at the age of 7 to join that battle. Chicago was proud to be the place where a man made money and money made a man. From the age of 7, Humphreys had been fighting on the street corners to sell his yellow press against other midgets. The child Humphreys, though, had the fortune to be taken up by a Chicago judge, Murray. In Chicago, even at the turn of the century, there was a history of a connection between money, the law, politics, and crime, rare for centuries past in Europe. The Tudors in Britain, Machiavelli in Italy, would have felt at home. Humphreys never forgot Judge Murray's lessons and took his name. Al Capone, his friend and colleague, was to become the greatest gangster the world has known, but which learned most from which. Just a few yards from Humphreys' birthplace is the scene of the most notorious massacre. St. Valentine's Day, 1929. This dreadful slaughter put down Capone's major rivals in the bootlegging business. At the time, it wasn't noticed. It also finished off Humphrey's enemy in the laundry business. nor that the careful placing of alibis with the police at the moment of execution was to be a Humphreys technique. When Capone went to jail on an income tax charge, the authorities named Humphreys as the new public enemy #1. Now, in his handsome heyday, Humphreys did not care for notoriety. He more or less arranged to be arrested and go to jail for a year to learn, he said, English and geometry. Once out of jail, meeting the mob again at Schneider's on Michigan Avenue, his advice became critical. He began to put Judge Murray's legal teaching to brilliant use. When he and the public leaders of the mob were on trial, he let the state go ahead until the case was in court, so that they could not be tried again because of double jeopardy. There was a smile of understanding from Murray Humphreys. He beamed, put on his coat, and departed from the courtroom before most of the crowd comprehended. Murray Humphreys lived modestly on South Bennett in Chicago with his part Cherokee wife Mary and daughter Luella. In the garden he built a tilting playhouse, a crooked house, he said, with unfailing irony. It stands still, a testimony to his lack of ostentation. Showing off was not only immodest, it was dangerous. His wish to keep his family away from his work was not unusual in the mob. He doted on his daughter, who still lives in Oklahoma, where he bought land. They watched birds. They shot wild animals. They also had a place in Florida for fishing. He built this house in Oklahoma himself. His daughter was christened Luella. Her father once said he would love it if she would be a concert pianist. She became a concert pianist and gave performances in Rome and then retired. She has never talked before about her father, and only did to me because of us both being Welsh. When you were young, was it difficult for you in Chicago, being the daughter of someone presented in the newspapers as public enemy #1, this notorious gangster?
Yes, very, in all ways. Children, of course, are the most cruel people in the world. And my own peer group was very hard on me. I used to get this, your old man's going to get it next, and this type of thing. It was very hard dating. Predominantly, the families of the young men wouldn't even consider them coming near me. One boy defied his family, and we went together for 4 years of high school. He wasn't afraid of Father. He accepted him as a person and got to know him that way. I had a lot of trouble in high school with the police. Whenever Father would leave town and they didn't know where he'd gone, they would come and take me out of school and hide me in some far-off remote precinct in the city, hoping that before my parents could find me, that they could get some information out of me as to where he was and what he was doing. And this is quite an emotional upheaval for a child. I have very firmly believed that we led an unusual life to the point that we got very confused. I mean, we would love these people as our parents, loving, giving, kind people, and then you read the headlines that they're supposed to be murderers. And it causes a lot of inner conflict. Several of us have ended up going to psychiatrists to unravel these things.
At home with some of your father's colleagues, for example, did you meet Al Capone?
Yes, when I was young, I met him. And several of them, Jake Cusick, I can go on forever. We were constantly going one to the other's house on Sunday. You know, we'd go for dinner or something. Granted, predominantly the men would go off and talk. But we knew these people and these men, I did, as Uncle So-and-so. And they were good, kind fathers and husbands and gentlemen. I remember Cusick one time, I was sitting on his lap. I was fascinated by pocket watches. And of course they wore them in that day. And they'd all let me play them because some of them were musical. And I took his one day. He was sitting next to the piano and I was beating it on the piano, and he said, "Hey kid, don't destroy my watch." But they would sing me lullabies, some of them. Take me up to bed and sing me a lullaby.
In Italian?
Yes.
Al Capone was born in the same year, 1899, as his comrade in crime, Murray Humphreys. Capone, though, died at the age of 48 of general paralysis of the insane brought on by syphilis. The Roman Catholic Church refused him a requiem mass to the surprise and dismay of his family. The church said it could not condone evil. It did, though, permit him to be buried here in Chicago on consecrated ground in his grandparents' tomb. They said that he was penitent, and he was fortified by the sacraments of the church. Of all the scores of hoods, though, those who had not been shot or were not in jail, who'd been Capone's colleagues, only 4 came to his funeral. One of them was the Baptist, Murray Humphreys. At home, he had hung his favorite mottos. The FBI maintains he invented the famous Fifth Amendment plea. His mementos capture some of his other jokes, too. But Humphrey's best joke, or so some scholars of Chicago crime think, was when he dressed himself shabbily and appeared in court, patched up and decrepit. He won pity and left within 5 minutes, only to shed his disguise and skip down the bars of Rush Street, buying drinks for his many friends. In Chicago, the tales of the generosity of gangsters to the poor were not myths. Even in the last century, they were popular for kindnesses. Humphreys, though, was unique among the Chicago rich, legitimate or illegitimate, in that he never set his charity against tax. So, in the loop in Chicago that encircles the real world, the young Humphreys had made it. If you're smart, why ain't you rich? Was Mammon's text. He'd been smart, he was rich. Was it not passing great to be a mobster and stroll in triumph through the loop? It sure was. Chicago is built not only on a swamp, but on a myth that if it had not been for bootlegging, it would not have been a criminal town. But even before Prohibition, or Capone, or Humphreys, politics and law and crime had walked hand in hand. The police had been known to change sides. Good citizens, crime commissions would try, but what if the mob ran the mayor? It had been known. But in the late 50s, the FBI sent in a neutral, William Romer, who pursued Humphreys for 8 years. He defined Humphreys' functions.
In the latter years, John, he had a fourfold function, actually. His first function, and the most important function that he was the head of what we call the corruption squad. In other words, he was the guy that was in charge for the outfit, for the Chicago Crime Syndicate, of corrupting public officials, members of the judiciary, law enforcement officers, labor leaders in particular, and public officials in general. His section function, when any member of organized crime got involved in any kind of a trial, then it was the duty and responsibility of Humphrey to mastermind the defense. The third function that he had was also a very important function, and that was the job of counseling his associates in organized crime as far as their racket activities were concerned. Now, Humphreys, in his latter years, in the 60s and in the 50s and so forth, he was the only living leader of organized crime who had been involved with Capone from the very beginning of organized crime in Chicago. So he obviously had an expertise that was second to none. And then his fourth function, and certainly not the least, was to counsel his associates in their legitimate investments. The Chicago Crime Syndicate was so big in Las Vegas, in the casinos, in the legalized gambling industry in Las Vegas, and that's where Humphreys went out to Los Angeles in 1946 with Bugsy Siegel, and then switched over from Los Angeles to Las Vegas in 47 and 48 at the very beginning when Las Vegas was just getting started, and counseled and made investments for the Chicago group, and not only for the Chicago group, but counseled because of his acknowledged leadership in organized crime across the country, counseled all the members of organized crime, the leaders of organized crime throughout the country, but of course his loyalty was to Chicago.
In Chicago, as everywhere in America, the Great Depression, some thought, would put an end to the gangs. That was another grand illusion of the 30s. Their insight into folly and human weakness was enduring. The gang's shrewd interpretation of the American dream was to lead to profits even greater than those made in the epoch of prohibition and bootlegging.
I can quote one time for you because it's so long ago, but several years ago, maybe 20 years ago, they were getting like $600 million a year out of gambling proceeds from just Las Vegas alone. And this was the Chicago's cut. So you can imagine the amount of money coming out. They had to go to large corporations, the most prominent ones in this country, in which to invest, naturally under dummy names.
How did he set about this important task, as you describe it, of corrupting people?
He had just a natural knack for it, John. I don't think that he went in. They didn't have any schools, for instance, to show you how to do this. He was just a charming individual. You had to know that Murray Humphreys was a murderer and a bomber and an extortionist. He was a charming person, and yet you knew underneath that this guy, through the years, had actually, with his own hands, killed people. And then in the latter years, when he was a top-notch person, had ordered and directed the killing of different people. And yet he was able to sit down, and he knew current events and foreign affairs. He could sit down with a judge and discuss law with a judge. He could sit down with a public official and discuss the different nuances of his responsibilities. He had an appearance about him, a presence about him, that when he sat with somebody, he was natural in that spot. Many of his associates were what I call them, these, and dozers. They didn't talk the language too well. But Murray Humphreys had a nice vocabulary. He was an articulate person and a very distinguished-looking individual. So he performed his task very, very well, John.
The gangsters in Chicago loved watching the great movies made about them. Little Caesar, Scarface, Public Enemy #1. But Murray Humphreys did more than watch them. He corrupted the cinema unions so that he could influence the films made. Hollywood became another of his oysters. And he did more than that even. He made his own home movies. Murray Humphreys' first home movies were primitive, 8mm black and white of Mam and Dad and his daughter Llywela. By 1940, though, he had moved on to 16mm and color. His time in Hollywood, corrupting the unions and intimidating Paramount and MGM, had not been wasted. Llywela writes to Father Christmas. The plot is simple. Father appears in his own film, Mother operating the camera. He looks very like his friend Fred MacMurray, a great actor of the time, another patriot of the Stars and Stripes. Mother and daughter wait for Santa. Father takes daughter to bed on Christmas Eve. Well, film in itself is usually commonplace if you don't know what it's about. When a great gangster puts his daughter to bed and it's his film, it's different. In Wales, the Humphreys family had been Methodists, but in Chicago they'd found it difficult to be near a Calvinist chapel, and so had become Baptists, or went to a community church. They were never tempted to join the Roman church most of Humphreys' colleagues in the mob were born into. The Humphreys prayers were nonconformist. This Christmas, as most after he took up his trade, prayers were to be answered in spades, though the Great Depression was not yet over for tens of millions in the USA. To see the delight of a young girl nearly half a century ago at Santa bringing just what she dreamed of is not unique, if rare. That the young girl should now offer the film, having refused it to all American companies and journalists, has a simple explanation. It's the Welsh connection. Blood will out. The films are a present to the Welsh, a cornucopia, as her Christmas gifts turned out to be in 1940. Murray Humphrey's mother leads the family into the Christmas lunch. There are many films of his family, but few of him. This may be a sign that he was not vain, but making films is a kind of vanity. Among them is the brother whom he employed in the Hollywood takeover, Ernest in a grey waistcoat. None of the other great gangsters have such archives. Humphreys, as time passes, extends his range on film. The Pacific he found terrific. Like many a self-taught man, he wanted to teach others. He anticipated the style of several current television reporters. Life on Earth, however exotic, was his oyster. The style was to become fashionable, earnest yet demotic. To coin a couplet, in his films, as in crime, he was well ahead of his time. The ship that carried the Humphreys from Pearl Harbor was the last to leave that port before the Japanese attack, which brought America into the Second World War. When Humphreys was editing the film he'd taken of the dreadful prison Alcatraz, where his old colleague Al Capone had gone mad, he put on the soundtrack the song, "The Gang's All Here." He found time to call in Hollywood, and with his wife met his friend, the actress Fay Wray, a hit in King Kong.
So how did your father's control over Hollywood affect your life? I mean, did your mother get to meet the film star?
Yes. I remember one time, at that time the studios had no tours like they do today. And Joan Crawford was a very big star at her peak then. And she always worked on a closed set to where no one could come on the set. And Mother wanted to meet her. And this particular set was extremely closed because she had a scar on her face in this movie, and she didn't want anyone to see her doing it. So the head of the studio took us in, and she stopped right in the middle of her scene and said, "Get those two out of here. I will not have it on my set. It's closed." And the head of the studio went over and told her, "Either they stay or you go, and you're through in pictures." So we watched her film her movie.
How did it affect your life otherwise? I mean, did you get yourself to meet a lot of the film
Oh,
stars or
yes.
people in entertainment?
Well, both through the movie studios, and then of course the organization owned many nightclubs in the major cities in the United States and in Cuba and other places. And through this, I met many, many stars and was very fortunate at my high school graduation. I had several couples come to a party, and Dad had Frank Sinatra come and entertain them.
Did you enjoy that?
Oh, yes. Who wouldn't? He was very thin then and very good looking. And then he sat and posed with each couple, and he was very nice about it. He signed their pictures.
So you had a very privileged childhood in that sense.
Yes, I did. It went into everything. We went to Broadway plays in New York. We never sat except third to fifth row center. And really, it was a life that he was a king. Anything he wanted, he had. But it was given, not demanded. It was given in homage. Maybe that's a word to use.
What was it about him that people were paying homage to?
Power. Absolute power. And respect for getting to the position they did, let's face it.
But was there behind this respect for their power a fear?
Probably underlying, yes. But I know in Father's position, he was such a likable person and very fair with everyone he dealt with that it got to be where there wasn't fear anymore. They knew that this man was an honest person and a fair person, and that if something happened, if they dropped a plate of spaghetti in his lap, he wasn't going to have them annihilated or lose their job. So it became a rapport between them, to where the fear then was gone.
A journalist who knew Humphreys well is the Pulitzer Prize winner Art Patak. So he was a very powerful man in Chicago.
Yes, he was. And I want to debunk a myth about an ethnic myth, where these rituals, like in the movie The Godfather and Casa Nostra, that is all a bunch of bunkum. In Chicago, they call themselves the Outfit. In Chicago, they refer to one another as being connected. And on an ethnic basis, we did not have all Italians by any means. We had Jews, we had a Welshman, Murray Humphreys, we had Sam Hunt, who I believe was Irish. We had Ralph Pierce, who I believe was Irish. We had Jack Guzik, who was Jewish. We had every ethnic group, except for some real minority types. We had no blacks. They were not a fair equal opportunity group. We had no black top bosses, nor Hispanics.
No English either.
No, the closest we came was Wales.
Was your father proud of being Welsh? Did it matter to him?
Oh, very. He was very proud. It was instilled to him from his parents that he had a great heritage by being Welsh. He unfortunately could not leave this country for fear of not being able to come back in. And there was a complexity there, was that my grandfather never took out citizenship because he still owned land in Wales. And Father regretted, he lived for the day when he could go back to Wales. And thank God, in 1963, 2 years before he died, he got to go back, and he loved it. He said it was more than he had ever dreamt that it would be.
The Humphreys had emigrated from the hill farm below Plynlimmon in mid-Wales. Not the Wales best known in verse and song, but when they left in the 19th century, nothing like as quiet as it looks. Robert Owen had breathed his socialist dream in this air. Troops had been sent to crush the Chartists here, and it took them a week. Murray Humphreys' parents were married in the Methodist chapel in China Street, Llanidloes. The lead mines to make the porcelain, as well as bullets, were at his mother's front door. His father's brother remained at home to become a justice of the peace. The nephew found it simpler to buy judges.
He stayed and settled the estate and sold the land because he knew he was on borrowed time. He had a bad heart. And he made sure that everyone got a deed to the property that had moved on to what was our original grant. And he was thrilled. He was glad. He'd made it home.
The argument of Humphrey's friends in the Loop in Chicago is that he was bound to have been a gangster. The violence of the ghetto, they said, gave him no choice.
No, I would never accept that argument, John. A lot of people grew up in the same neighborhood in the same era that he did, and they didn't turn out to be gangsters and mobsters and so forth. Murray Humphreys, actually, I feel just the opposite, John, as a matter of fact. Murray Humphreys had a talent. He had an intelligence, a native intelligence, that would have enabled him to do anything. He could have been a success in almost any phase or aspect of our society. And it was a shame that he actually committed himself to the pursuit of these animals that he associated himself with, because that's just what they are. They're dregs of society, and his functioning on their behalf enabled them to be so much more efficient and effective than they actually would have been if it hadn't been for a person like Murray Humphreys. So no, I would never accept that, John. No way.
When Murray Humphreys died, Mike Royko, the celebrated Chicago newspaper columnist and wit, marked the occasion. Humphreys, he wrote, was a highly skilled talent scout. According to scholars of such matters, he was the crime syndicate's leading recruiter of young blood, if you'll pardon the expression. Humphreys died of unnatural causes. a heart attack. He could reach into the backwoods and find a talented machine gun player. Sam Giancana, the gang boss who was later murdered by a friend, Sam Giancana was little more than an unknown semi-illiterate. When Humphreys took him in hand, he became a well-known semi-illiterate. James Cat Eyes Katura had no real direction in life until Humphreys put him to blowing up people and things. Nobody knows exactly how Humphreys did it, wrote Mike Rodko. Some people thought he would rap a prospect on the head, and if he heard a bongo drum sound, he knew he had a recruit. Others said that Murray Humphreys would judge a prospect by his parents. If he had any, he was discarded. There is another theory, that his system was no more complicated than turning over a rock and seeing what crawled out. He also discovered some politicians.
Father didn't have a great respect for politicians because he knew that he could control them. He even knew Harry Truman. And one time, Mother and I were fortunate enough to be in Washington, and Harry Truman took us around. He became president right shortly thereafter.
Chicago at the end of the 50s and in the early 60s grew taller and grander, but the mob was in trouble. Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, was using a computer to track them down. How could he do this when they'd helped elect his brother, not to mention his father's connections? Kennedy was out to break the outfit.
Do you think Bobby Kennedy's days were numbered once he decided to do that?
I personally feel it, yes. I feel that he stepped on some toes. And I think that a great deal was talked about, you know, how they could remedy this situation.
It was always something of a mystery that in the presidential election between Adlai Stevenson and General Eisenhower, the business or the syndicate in Chicago, which was normally supporting the Democrats, supported General Eisenhower. Now, what did your father have to do with that?
Well, the thing was that they had backed Stevenson very severely and strongly. And they had a project going in Chicago about clearing out some slum areas and building the high-rise, low-cost housing. And the gentleman from the organization gave a great deal of money toward this cause on the purpose of being from the heart rather than gaining monetary value. The houses were constructed, and the company was Adlai Stevenson's construction company. About a year after the tenants moved in, the walls started crumbling, the plumbing went bad, everything in there. In other words, everything was sub material. He had really cut corners, more than the normal graft. When the gentlemen found this out, they changed sides. They decided to back Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Father went to interview him several times about his ideas and certain promises that would be kept. And then a few gentlemen, 5 to be exact, in a room in Chicago decided who would be the next president of the United States. And I was fortunate enough to have gotten in on the very tail end of the meeting.
So you met President Eisenhower?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I really felt very embarrassed because I was very for Dwight D. Eisenhower, but I'd always seen him just in his uniform with his peaked cap. And he was in a suit and he had a receding hairline. And they were talking about Eisenhower, and one of the gentlemen said to me, "What do you think about him?" And I said, "I think he's great." I said, "I'll vote for him if I could as the next president of the United States." And the man next to me said, "Thank you very much, young lady," and it was Dwight D. Eisenhower. I felt rather that small.
Now, though, for all his connections, the FBI were closing in. Murray Humphreys, at the age of 66, was at home with his first wife and his daughter in Oklahoma, enjoying himself. Then he had a telephone call from his brother Ernest, saying the FBI had a warrant out for him. He went to catch a train and was arrested. It was a strange business, but there is one certainty. Whatever he was wanted for, he would have won the day. He was freed on bail, but then made a serious mistake. Back in Chicago, the allegation was that Murray Humphreys pulled a gun on the FBI. He was in his flat on the 52nd floor of the Marina building. The FBI had sent 3 of their best agents up to arrest him.
So he fought with them, and we knew that he had a safe in his apartment, and that in that safe he had a black book in which he had the names and telephone numbers and the addresses of the people that he had corrupted, the public officials and the labor leaders and the law enforcement officers and so forth. And so we wanted that black book. He, for the same reasons that we wanted it, he didn't want us to have that black book, and so he fought with him, and he had the keys to his safe in his pocket, and he put his hand in his pocket and he refused to let them get those keys, and so they had to rip the pants pocket off, take the keys from his person forcibly, and fight with him, and it created quite an emotional situation and a stressful physical situation at that time. He then was arraigned. We brought him downtown, and he was arraigned, and he was let go immediately on bail. I forget what the bail was, but it was something like $100,000 or something, and he made that very quickly, and he was released. And I'll never forget that night. I was watching on television back home after the day at 10 o'clock in the evening, and a girl by the name of Jory Luloff was interviewing him on television, on the local television station here in Chicago, and she stuck her microphone up in front of Mr. Humphreys as he was making bond, and she said, "Any comment, Mr. Humphreys?" And he said, "I only have one comment." He said, "My, you're a very pretty girl." that was vintage Humphreys, I think. And I laughed, and I turned off the television set, and I went in to take a shower. And while I was taking a shower that evening, my wife came in. She said, "There's somebody on the phone for you, honey." And I said, "Well, gee, tell him I'm taking a shower and get the message." She came back and she said, "The message is Murray Humphreys dropped dead of a heart attack this evening. They found him in his apartment." John, it was like a friend of the family or a relative passed away. It was a chapter in my life that was now ending. I didn't sleep hardly at all that night. I really missed. I knew that he was a murderer and an extortionist and an intimidator and an acid thrower and everything. I knew all the bad things about Murray Humphreys, but in the 50 or so contacts that I had with Murray Humphreys, I learned to have a grudging respect for that man, and I knew that I was never going to see him again. I was never going to have a contact with him again, and it saddened me. It really did.
He made a decision of the times. He really was not an educated man, and at that time and era, you either were educated or you went into the organization. That was the only way to make money. And he vowed that his, me and mine, would never do without like he had. And he got in it. He worked hard. He was trustworthy. He was honest. He was loyal. But it got to be an awful strain. I remember one night when I was in high school, they thought I was asleep. And he and Mother were talking. And he said, "I am so tired." He said, "I want out so bad." But he said, "I made my decision and I have to live with it."
When Murray Humphreys died of a heart attack at the age of 66 in Chicago, he left behind a question that concerns, the city underworld and the mafia. Where was his great fortune? He was thought to have $10 million in cash. In his safe, a piece of paper was found which had on it the numbers 460, 400, at 20. What do these numbers mean? I suppose it was characteristic of him to leave behind so elusive and mischievous a question. So, where is the treasure of Llewellyn Morris Humphreys, Murray Humphreys, Murray the Hump, Murray the Camel, Moneybags, Curly, the brainy Welsh hood who, never seeking the limelight, did so much to mold modern America?